All right, so now that we've done what I think of as the setup for talking about civil liberties, let's move on and talk about specific amendments, talk about roughly where we are on each of those amendments over time. Also, really quickly, make sure, please, that you check out that wonderful video called Constitution USA, hosted by Peter Sagal. The one I think that I've posted on civil liberties is called, oh bloody heck, what is it called? It's a Free Country. Check it out. It's pretty wonderful. And if you watch that and listen to this and read over the lecture notes and read the book, the chapter on civil liberties, you'll be good to go indeed. All right, so let's get started. First up has to be the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. These are the very first words, remember, of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Right? Very broad phrasing, suggesting that the founders did not want Congress to make laws that dealt with, facilitated, made possible the establishment of an official state religion. I call it the anti-King Henry VIII Amendment, right? Because back in the day, King Henry VIII needed a divorce. His wife was not bearing him a male heir to the throne. He was a Catholic. England was a Catholic country. The Pope would not give him that divorce. He said, the heck with the Catholic Church, the heck with the Pope, the heck with Sir Thomas More. He creates the Church of England. And what was the Church of England? A church that was willing to give him his divorce, a church that was prepared to bolster civil authority. King Henry combined both secular and religious authority and into one in the form of the Church of England. We wanted to avoid that, right? We wanted to avoid that sort of thing. So there we have it. So the question becomes, how do we read that broad language? Two basic schools of thought here. Wall of separation from that letter from Jefferson, long after he had been president. He talked about the possibility of a wall of separation between church and state, suggesting never the twain shall meet. Versus accommodationism, which says that the government should accommodate all religions. As long as they accommodate all religions, they're not establishing any one religion, and that's okay. So those are the two basic positions here. There's others, but those are the two basic ones, the two pragmatic possible ones, I think, in American politics. We've been back and forth between those two positions over time. The Warren Court definitely was more of a wall of separation court. I would say more recent courts have veered back towards accommodationism. Historically, of course, we were heavily accommodationist, if not even going further than that, mostly facilitating one particular religion, or at least one particular broad tradition, Christianity. But as we became more diverse, that became less possible, less desirable. So these days, maybe more accommodationist. The Warren Court years more separationist. And always somewhere in between. Neither of those completely. Somewhere in between. Good examples of that. Really quickly on currency and coins, it says, "In God we trust." The court has basically said that's okay. You know, it's not too specific. It's fairly generic. It's almost like a kind of civil religion. It's a part of our history. Although I would say, as part of our history during the Cold War, it was a way to beat the Russians, right? Add that in to make it clear that we were a God-fearing country. The Soviet Union was not. The Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. Again, that's a Cold War relic designed to accentuate the differences between us and them, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And that was, inserted then in the 1950s as a way to make that clear. The court has said, so far at least, near as we can tell, that that's okay. That's okay. That's not an establishment either. The Ninth Circuit ruled otherwise, but then the court heard that on appeal and said that, in this case, the father of a child who had to do the Pledge of Allegiance in a public school, that he did not have standing in that case because he did not have custody, so that the lawsuit was moot. So the Ninth Circuit decision was essentially vacated. The court has never made it completely clear where they stand, but I would say, realistically, they're going to say, if they ever had to decide that case on the merits, they would say, look, the pledge is okay. It's generic, it's broad, it's vague, it's part of our history, accommodationism. A moment of silence. There, the court has been a little more wall of separation. It was established back in the 60s by the Warren Court. In a public school, the teacher can ask for a moment of silence, but if he or she suggests prayer during that moment of silence, even alongside other things like meditation or just sleeping, as soon as a teacher says prayer, boom, unconstitutional in the view of the court. So there they've been a little more wall of separation, mostly because these are kids. The teacher is an authority figure. The court's been pretty sensitive about that. The president, right, always uses the Bible at inauguration ceremonies, from Washington to Obama. They put their hand on the Bible during the inauguration ceremony in January, and they say, "So help me God." Well, again, the court's been good with that. It's generic, it's broad, it's part of our history, going back to George Washington. So a lot of accommodationism, a little bit of wall of separation. Those are just some quick examples. For some others, take a look at the book. Some very nice material in there on the Establishment Clause. But the court's been pretty willing to tolerate a certain intermingling between church and state, so long as it doesn't cross a certain line. They've used the term excessive entanglement. They don't want to see excessive entanglement. But as long as it's not quote unquote excessive entanglement, they're good to go. What is excessive exactly? Eye of the beholder. But mostly they've been willing to let a lot of things go and go, yeah, that's okay, that's okay, that's okay. As long as it doesn't get too specific, too heavy-handed. You post the Ten Commandments in a courtroom, no good, right? You have a statute that says maybe in God we trust, that's probably okay. All right, let's move on. And there's more that could be said about that, heaven knows, but let's move on. All right, so two categories of free exercise of religion to talk about here. One is going to be, and it's going to be the primary discussion item here, general laws passed by the government that apply to everybody, including religious minorities who may claim that as a result their free exercise is being infringed, and then targeted laws targeted at religious minorities. Okay, so number one, right, recognize, look, free exercise, like any other right, is limited, right? There are boundaries as part of the social contract. No rights are absolute. Free exercise of religion, no different. Okay, so recognize that. Now, in terms of general laws, how the court deals with that is captured in a case from 1990 called Smith. It's just somewhat, the facts get a little convoluted. It's two Native Americans. They ingest peyote from time to time as part of their tribe's religious practices. As a result, they both test positive for the metabolites of peyote at work. They're fired for that reason. They then apply for unemployment from, I think it's the state of Oregon. And the state of Oregon denies it and says, no, you were fired for cause, for testing positive. And they go, yeah, but we're effectively being punished, right, for our religious beliefs translated into practices. Free exercise claim, right, against a general law that applies to everybody. Just say no to drugs kind of a thing, right? So the court looks at that and says, look, in cases like this, general laws that apply to everybody, but do incidentally burden a religious minority, the burden of proof is going to be massively on the shoulders of the religious minorities claiming an exemption from a general law. We're almost always going to side with the government. All right? That's the essence of Smith. And in this case, they side with the government. They said, the state has a compelling interest in making it a crime to ingest peyote or whatever, hallucinogenic you might wish to choose, and that overrides a religious minority's right to free exercise. Right? That's not a popular decision by the court. Both Democrats and Republicans don't like it. They think it's a little bit tyrannical, too much intention with legitimate free exercise claims. So they passed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, bipartisan. And the court looks at it, right? And they uphold most of it. But they do separate out one part of it that says, oh, hey, Congress says in this law, oh, hey, when there's a general law and a religious claim of exemption by a religious minority, The burden of proof is on the government to make out an extraordinary case, that generally the court should favor the religious minority and really hold the government's feet to the fire by demanding that if they're going to override free exercise claims with general laws, they've got to have a really compelling reason to do so. Right? Now the court rejects that. They say, no, look, we already said it's the opposite, right? We already said that in cases of general laws, the burden's on the minority to make out an extraordinary case. So you can't change that, because that's our interpretation of the First Amendment. Who has the final say on the meaning of the Constitution? The Supreme Court, not Congress, unless they're going to amend the Constitution, which is not what they did with RFRA, right? All right. So that part of RFRA is struck down. All right, so that's where we're at now, right? It's kind of status quo. Now, two cases that make it kind of interesting, Hobby Lobby from 2014, and then Masterpiece Cake Shop from 2018. So Hobby Lobby, right, that was a private corporation that was bound by the terms of the Affordable Care Act to provide contraception coverage for their employees. And they said, no, we don't provide contraception because we're pro-life and contraception goes against our deeply held religious beliefs. What the court says, and it's a little tricky, they said, okay, we're going to allow Hobby Lobby to get an exemption from the ACA on this issue because it does contravene their free exercise beliefs, practices, and but we're going to invoke the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which we just got done talking about, right? Again, most of that was upheld, right, in Bourne v. Flores. So the court says, in this case, well, RFRA, right, which comes down on the side of religious minorities generally, it does permit closely held corporations, where you've got just like a family corporation, and that family has strong religious beliefs. In those narrow sort of set of cases, RFRA does allow them to get an exemption from contraception coverage under the Affordable Care Act, right? So it's a pretty narrowly decided case. Incidentally, the Trump administration issued a rule late in his term in office to expand that exemption to all corporations, whether they're closely held by a family or not. I don't know that it ever went into effect. It was pretty late in the game, and I don't think the Biden administration takes quite the same view on that issue. So the Hobby Lobby does allow for a free exercise exemption of sorts here, but under RFRA, right? Not under the First Amendment per se, under RFRA, without getting into the thorny details of that interpretation of that law passed by Congress. And so the court is indicating, right, a real willingness to accommodate free exercise whenever they can. Very controversial case, as you would imagine. Because if you're a woman working for Hobby Lobby, you're denied, right, coverage for contraception. But court upheld that denial. And then another narrowly decided case, Masterpiece Cake Shop, 2018. The court was looking at a decision by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission that a baker that bakes cake for the public, right? If they're asked to bake a wedding cake by a same-sex couple, they have to do exactly that. Otherwise, they violate Colorado civil rights law that says no discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So again, it gets a little weedy here. Sorry about that. And what the court rules is that there was evidence that the commission, the ones that gave that interpretation to Colorado law, that the Civil Rights Commission had demonstrated a general hostility to religion in their deliberations on this issue. And because they had demonstrated that hostility, that made them a biased decision maker. And in cases, in other words, where you've got a Civil Rights Commission at the state level interpreting state law, and in doing so, they evince hostility towards religion. In those cases, but those cases only, the free exercise of religion claim here is going to be upheld, right? That the owner of the bake shop does not have to bake cakes for same-sex couples but only under those very factually specific circumstances, right? So again, that's an even narrower holding, right, than the Hobby Lobby case. That might really just be a one-off, right, sort of a situation. All right, but again, very controversial. The court was split like they were in Hobby Lobby. Right, these are hot button issues. But again, I think the court is trying to show, because they're more conservative these days, right? Trying to show that they are super sensitive to free exercise claims within the boundaries of the Smith decision from 1990, which is still the guiding case here. But it is undermined a little bit, right, maybe by both of these cases in a way. That's worth noting. Right? The court's always changing, always shifting. They're still, they haven't overturned Smith, but they've undermined it in some relatively small ways recently. And then finally, right, I said two categories of law here, free exercise. General laws, we just talked about that, right? Applicable cases, Smith, Bourne v. Flores, Hobby Lobby, Masterpiece Cake Shop. And then finally, targeted laws that are targeted at religious groups. That's Church of the Lukumi Babalu A from 1993. That was a situation down in a parish in Louisiana, which has parishes and not counties because they were originally colonized by the French. Kind of a unique system of governance down there. But it was a case where a local government passed a law banning the ritual sacrifice of goats. And you're like, well, that's weird. That's an oddly specific sort of a law. It is generally applicable to everybody, right? But it was very clear in that case. This was bullshit. They were targeting a Santorian church, a religious minority that had a tradition of ritually sacrificing goats. All right. So basically, I think it was the city council down there said, well, that's gross. That freaks us out. That's weird. We're going to ban ritual sacrifice of goats. Right? Clearly targeting a religious minority. Clearly targeting it. And that's what the court said. Oh, come on, man. Who are you kidding? This is not really a general law. I mean, technically it is, but it's not, right? It's targeted at one religious minority that's not popular, that violates their free exercise claims. Can't do it. And so targeted laws are basically never going to be upheld, absent some insanely extraordinary burden of proof satisfied by the government. So, all right, I know that's a lot, but that's what we need to talk about in order to talk coherently about how the Supreme Court has interpreted the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. Next up, still the First Amendment. That's a very busy amendment. That First Amendment also protects free speech. The court has defined that as a preferred freedom. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And essentially, if you're thinking about what is the meaning of that First Amendment, a good place to go on that would be John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, a brilliant book from back in the day, 19th century, a brilliant defense of a very wide, free, open marketplace of ideas as the best way to do things in a democracy. Has the court always been there on the First Amendment and free speech? Hell no. Hell no. Think about it, right? We begin this country with the Federalists in control. After Washington, Adams was president. They were worried about this rising young party called the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And so what did they do? In 1798, they passed the Sedition Act, designed to make it a crime to criticize the government. Bad, bad news, right? Was that seen as a violation of the First Amendment? I don't think that it was, because we did not have a strong culture of free speech back then. Fortunately, although the court never did anything about it, Jefferson was against it, and once he was elected president, he got rid of that poisonous legislation. So we start out in a pretty shaky way, right, where we don't have any strong sense of free speech necessarily, certainly not coming from the Supreme Court. That doesn't really come until the early to mid 20th century. We get it in two famous cases, Schenck, which went against free speech, although the court did say, hey, look, free speech can only be punished if it poses a clear and present danger to the nation. This was a guy arguing against participation in World War I. against U.S. participation. He was distributing pamphlets in Yiddish on the waterfront in New York City, trying to encourage resistance to the draft. That was considered by the court to be a clear and present danger to the nation, and he was therefore allowed to be prosecuted and convicted of violating, I think it was the Espionage Act, and put in prison. Bad news, right? Bad news. Over the summer, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, maybe our greatest Supreme Court justice, certainly in the top 3 or 4, along with his colleague Brandeis, they changed their minds and they realized, you know what, we screwed up in Schenck. It should be clear and present danger, but we need to use it more aggressively to protect free speech. So in Abrams, a very similar situation in the fall of 1919, after that summer break that they had, Holmes and Brandeis write a dissenting opinion, but still an opinion that argues for a stronger vision of free speech, one that looks more like John Stuart Mill's on liberty. So there we see the beginnings of change, the beginnings of a commitment to genuinely free speech, even if it irritates us, even if it's not popular, especially if it's not popular. The court has a responsibility to do exactly that, right? To be, in some cases, counter-majoritarian, to fight against majority tyranny. And there are some, there's some forward progress and then some backsliding during World War II because of national security issues, the Red Scare after World War II, McCarthyism, again, bad news. The court endorses that bullshit. We lose a lot of free speech ground. But then I would say after the mid to late 1950s, the court and the American people finally get serious about free speech, finally, in a serious and consistent way. So I would say since then, the court and we the people have been pretty good on free speech, pretty good. Not always, but pretty good. And something today that we take for granted. The standard these days is clear and imminent danger. So you can talk about, in a very general way, using violence to overthrow the U.S. government. You can definitely do that, highly protected. But if you say, hey, I want violence against the U.S. government, let's gather here, let's talk about a plan for blowing up this building, and then let's kill these people, right? You do that, whoa, you've crossed the line. You are now posing a clear and imminent danger. The danger is clear, it's imminent, it's about to happen. You've made very specific plans. That is not protected, not protected. But just about everything else is, right? Just about everything else is. Westboro Baptist Church, see that video again on Constitution USA. Super unpopular, super inappropriate, deeply disrespectful to members of our military and the nation, and yet protected, right? Protected, the court said, protected. The government can regulate it a little bit. They can say, stay 50 yards away from the funeral, don't use megaphones, that sort of thing, but mostly pretty much protected. Flag burning, protected. Is that popular speech? Heck no. Would most people vote against that as protected speech? They would. But the court has said, hey, look, you got to keep that marketplace open. The best remedy to bad speech is good speech, not censorship. That's where the court's at these days, by and large. Some think they've gone too far. Some think they've gone too far. That's an ongoing debate, of course. But right now, at least, the court has been very strong on free speech in recent years. And again, something maybe too strong. To finish up the second part on civil liberties, there'll be a third part, and hopefully not a fourth part. We'll see. Let's talk about the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Historically, the court really didn't speak to this at all. I think they spoke to it once in about 1930, and in that case, I think it was called Miller. All they really said was, look, the Second Amendment means what it says. The security of a free state. It's got to be connected to that. There is a collective right to bear arms as part of a well-organized militia to secure the safety of a free state. So that really became, right, in a sense, a very narrow reading of that Second Amendment, that only protects the right of states to have organized militias. So those who are members of that organized militia to protect the state, only they are guaranteed federally the right to keep and bear arms. That was changed radically in the case of D.C. v. Heller. Just a few years ago. In that decision, the court said, you know what? And it was hotly contested. It was 5-4, very controversial. The court said, you know what? That Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It is a collective right, but it's also an individual right. that idea of a organized militia, that's one way to do it, but it doesn't leave out other ways of doing it, which is an individual right to keep and bear arms. So the court read it very broadly this time, very broadly, 5-4. And they said, look, it's an individual right, applies to the federal government, District of Columbia. District of Columbia can have reasonable regulations, but anything that is unreasonable, I the beholder to some extent, of course, but anything that the court deems to be unreasonable is unconstitutional under the Second Amendment if it somehow infringes on individual ownership of firearms. And then the court follows that up, of course, right, 2 years later with McDonald v. Chicago, in which they apply that same argument to state and local governments. That's part of, again, selective incorporation that we talked about a little while ago. So we certainly have, just in the last few years, developed a very different Second Amendment jurisprudence, one that does a much better job, if you will, at the federal level of providing certain guarantees for the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right, not just a collective right.